Hello, my name is John Brink, and we are podcasting on the Brink from downtown Prince George, the capital of northern British Columbia. A beautiful spring day in the north here. We are podcasting BC forest industry in transition, and we have a special guest today, Dave Peterson. He is an RPF registered professional forester, very knowledgeable, has been in this industry in all different sectors for a long, long time. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John, and pleased to be here and welcome from where I am in Vernon, BC, the center of the southern interior, I like to say. And again, a beautiful spring day here. I actually just spent the morning spring skiing, which is my passion.
My goodness, and we have a lot of people from around the world watching us. So Prince George is about 750 kilometers north of Vancouver and halfway in the absolute middle of the province. Vernon is about, what would it be? About how far from Vancouver, David?
About 350 kilometers, so almost halfway between Vancouver and Prince George, and a little towards the Rocky Mountains from there.
Nice area to ski in, eh? Very good skiing there.
Beautiful area, and it's been a very good winter and spring for skiing. So that is one of my passions that I'm still able to thoroughly enjoy.
So, tell me a little bit about your past, David. Are you originally from BC, and where did you, which area were you born and where you were trained and educated, that sort of thing?
So thanks, John. And before I do, I would just like to thank you and compliment you on these podcasts and this initiative of yours. And I've tracked your career and your accomplishments for many years, and I find this really laudable, what you are doing now with the podcast. So thanks and congratulations.
Well, I
And I
appreciate
should
that.
probably make one technical correction because the Association of Forest Professionals is very diligent. I am no longer a registered professional forester. I just retired from that profession, and I cannot claim I am an RPF anymore, John, and uh, would not want them coming after me once they look at your podcast.
Yeah, and thank you for the comment that you made. Is designated by the association, a registered professional forester. You have been qualified as a registered professional forester for many, many, many years, and we'll talk about that. The technicality of the association is that if you are retired, then automatically you will lose the designation of a registered professional forester. That is not to say that you not have an abundance of knowledge and experience.
And thank you for that, John. So I actually grew up in a small logging community on Vancouver Island. Jordan River, that now, as in so many of these small communities, no longer has an active forest industry, and in fact, there no longer is an active town there.
Where was
But
that, David? Which,
it's southern Vancouver Island, so now with the highways, it's only about a 2.5 hour drive from Victoria, but out towards Port Renfrew. People have probably heard
right,
of Port Renfrew.
yeah.
Grew up there, went through, started my career in forestry there. Actually, my first full-time employment was working in the industry setting chokers in the forests. And then I worked at a sawmill in Souk. Souk is actually the spot that had the first commercial sawmill in the province of BC. Graduated from the University of Victoria with a degree in physical geography, natural resource management. And then, John, I spent more or less the first 15 years of my career in forestry in wildfire fighting. through the
Okay.
summer, and then various activities in the winter. Much of that west of Williams Lake, in the Chilcotin country west of Williams Lake. Last summer, actually, in Northwest Territories, parachuting into forest fires as a smoke jumper.
So,
And then,
yeah, go ahead.
oh, go ahead. Yeah.
So again, for the benefit of our watcher, British Columbia is huge, and especially for people in Europe, that Williams Lake again is about 500 kilometers north of Vancouver, and really is in the middle of the kind of interior of the province with lots of forest around it, and forest fires a lot of times happen throughout the province, either because of people because not being cautious, and other ones because of weather, and the or especially thunder and lightning. So, what brought you to the industry, forest industry? Why did you? What attracted you to it? Being first chokers and then going further in, taking your studies and then into protection.
Well, what attracted me to it was really growing up. My father worked within the industry, and so growing up in a town that was dependent on the industry, I could see the kind of employment and see the jobs. But like so many things in life, and John, I'm sure you've had circumstances like this as well. I got into forestry almost by accident,
Yeah.
by a quirk of fate. The summer of 1973, I actually started working in the aluminum smelter in Kitimat.
Okay.
Again, for benefit of geography, about 500 kilometers, I think, west of Prince George in the central part of British Columbia. And I worked there for about 2 weeks and had a job offer to instead join the BC Forest Service and work on their summer firefighting crew. And I actually debated for a little while and chose to go really where my passion already was, into the forestry field. But if I hadn't made that choice, um,
You'll be
I'm not
selling
sure
Kidman.
where I would have ended up in life in the aluminum smelter.
Yeah, probably in Kidman.
Yeah.
Yeah, could well be, right? So yeah, for me the same. My dad was involved in lumber and manufacturing, and so was my grandfather was a master carpenter. So that's how kind of it happens in Europe. A lot of times in here as well, to a certain extent. That's where the family had their careers, and so then you were. And so where did you go from there then to,
So
yeah,
So from there to the central part of British Columbia, the area I called the Chilcotin, which is west of the town of Williams Lake, as you said.
right,
If I remember correctly, the area of the Chilcotin is almost the same as the total area of Holland.
yeah,
So again, back to
amazing,
just geography, just this the scale
yeah,
of the province. From the wildfire fighting, I took some more courses, became a registered professional forester, and got into the field of land use planning and timber supply planning. Again, still with the provincial government for that. The forests in British Columbia predominantly are owned by the public. And so the planning work and the timber supply work for that is done by the public. The mid 1980s, there was a very significant amount of work being done around the province on deciding what areas should be available for parks and what areas should be available for forestry activity. And at that time, I was heavily involved in the Caribou-Chilcotin land use plan. And coming out of the completion of that land use plan, I had an opportunity to leave government and work directly for the forest industry. And so I started initially as president of the Caribou Lumber Manufacturers Association, one of the lumber manufacturers associations just to the south of the Kofi area that I believe Brink Forest Products was a member of, and
Right.
then from there I moved into working for a sawmilling company in Williams Lake. This work was all in Williams Lake, Lignum Limited, and then at a time that there was a lot of transition in the industry, Lignum then was purchased by another company, Riverside, and Riverside in turn
By
purchased by Talco.
and that was
Um,
about in 2004, I believe. That Lignum, Jay Kerr was
yes.
the CEO of Lignum, and Lignum again was a sawmill, very a grouping of sawmills that were the mid-sized sawmills. Lignum was very much part of that. The Kerr family started that operation in 1946, and then had two sons, I think, and a daughter. That when the dad passed away, Jay Kerr became the CEO of the company, or president, and he decided to sell. I believe it was about 2004, and was quite public actually when that sale happened of that company. Now, then in particular, we had a lot of sawmills still throughout the entire province, down the coast, in the interior, and not, by comparison to then, a lot less now. But just talking about this particular transaction, again, as you already indicated, BC is unique where at least 95% of the timber in the province is controlled and owned by you and me, the people of British Columbia. And then the rest is either private or in some other form owned by others. And the sawmill of Lignum, producing primarily dimension lumber, was at the time very interesting, very public, because it was sold to Riverside Industry, a company owned by, I believe, Gordy Steele, that bought it for $100 million and acquired Lignum Industry. And everybody was kind of part of that, because then the next thing that happened at Riverside, again, the very impressive company in the Okanagan region. Were they not in Vernon? Where were they located again?
Yes.
In
Yeah.
Vernon. And I'm just trying to go by memory now that they left themselves vulnerable as the shareholdings, because one of their other competitors and was Talco, and the Thorlickson family, and I don't know if Harold was still in charge or Brad was already in charge, already owned 18% of Riverside, and they decided to bid on it, and there was a bidding war, and Talco, Interfor tried to buy it, and then Talco ended up buying it. And so
Yes.
it was an example of the consolidation of the industry and larger companies. It continued from there on forward with many others, but not quite as dramatic as this one, because there was a lot of struggles in between, a lot of upping of the prices and all the other things. Now, you obviously were right in the middle of all of it, because you were at Lignum, then hired as, because came with the package by Riverside, and then the following week or so acquired by Talco.
Yeah. Your memory is bang on with that, John. And certainly I was very much in the middle of it. Riverside and Talco both North Okanagan companies, both really based in Vernon, had grown up as competitors, as you say. Riverside actually hoped by purchasing Lignum, they would make themselves less vulnerable to Tolko. And as
Yeah.
you put it, John, it actually turned out to be the opposite.
Yes.
And and yes, so then I was part of the executive of Lignum, part of that initial transaction, and which really was a friendly takeover of the smaller company, and then part of the transaction with Talco, which was competitors, two
Yes.
competitors, as you say, considerable bidding war. And then I stayed with Talco for another 3 years, and then had the opportunity to go back to government, and I took on the role of responsible for BC timber sales for
Okay.
the province, which was a division of government. And you may have some questions, or you want some dialogue around that. And then that was in I think mid 2000s, and became an assistant deputy minister responsible for BC timber sale. And then since that time, carried on in a number of assistant deputy minister roles. I was chief forester for the province for a while, so absolutely very much involved in forestry for the province. 10 years in competitiveness, the forest tenure side, which is the method that the province uses to give access to the timber, the timber owned by the public, to give access through to the industry. And then I was deputy minister of forests for a while during one of the provincial transitions of government. And then, John, my last 5 years actually has been a pretty considerable change of career. I've been involved primarily in helping communities recover from natural disasters. Started out of the wildfires of 2017 and all the communities impacted just south and west of Prince George.
Lytton,
And
Lytton comes to mind for one, and then
yes,
the
yep.
communities around us here, and
Mm.
thousands of people came. The communities all kind of pulled together. Was an extreme and amazing managing by the people in the region to accommodate those that were affected. Also, a
Yes.
very good job by government in organizing this. So that was 2017, 2018 in particular, I believe.
Yes, that was the fires. 2018 also saw flooding.
Yeah,
Grand Forks, almost in United States,
yeah,
right at the very southern end of the province,
correct.
got hit by a significant flood.
Yeah,
And I was active there at this that same summer. The small community of Telegraph Creek, almost in the north end of the province, almost in the Yukon, got
yes,
impacted by wildfire.
yeah,
And I was part of both of that. And then, absolutely, more recently, there was the flooding in the Lower Mainland, in Merritt and Princeton, and the fire that went through the community of Lytton.
yeah, yeah. And so was that then FESABC? Forest. So you were also appointed as a director and new chair of the FESBC, and that's the acronym for.
Forest Enhancement Society of BC, which actually not a direct connection to that community recovery work, but one of the roles I had within the Ministry of Forests in 2015 was the establishment of this society. And so I was on the board of the Forest Enhancement Society when it was initially formed in 2016. And I am still on the board and have just taken on the role of chairman of the board for the Forest Enhancement Society. And as a non-government employee, John, I know you do a lot of research of everything. I'm not sure that you were aware. I just retired from the government in the end of last year,
Correct. Yeah.
just at Christmas time last year. And
Yes.
so I've taken on that role of chairman of Forest Enhancement Society.
As an independent, but not as part of government. Is
Yes.
Snetzinger on that as well? Because the two of you were quite involved together,
So,
and
so,
and yeah,
so Jim Snetzinger was on it, and he was the most recent chair.
right,
He just stepped down. And so
correct,
I've taken over, and he stepped down. Wayne Clogg, coming out of West Fraser,
yeah,
was also Jim and Wayne and I were there right from the very start.
correct.
And Wayne Clogg was the chairman at first, and then Jim took over, and both of them stepped down as of this year.
And both of you, at some point in your lives, had the role of being the senior forester for the province of British Columbia,
Yes.
and which meant in a role that you were leading management of the whole forest in British Columbia, and then directly reporting. Was that an assistant deputy minister status or deputy minister status, or were you reporting to a deputy minister?
Reporting to a deputy minister, so that's assistant deputy minister status, is that chief forester
Right.
is the term for that. And again, for people who aren't familiar with the geography, that's approximately 100 million hectares of
Right.
land that are
Huge.
covered under that management.
Yeah. It is huge. You know, so if you kind of look back through a career like this, what in particular stands out because it has always been an industry in transition. I came here in July of 1965 from Holland, with the dream of building a lumber mill with my $25.47 and a couple of blocks away from here. And since that time, the industry has been in transition and still is today. What are the memories that stand out in your mind as things that happened during that period, that you can share with us?
Lots of them, as you can well imagine, John. But when I think back, probably four most particularly, and they all four kind of relate to some of the big transitions in my career. I certainly have memories of the intense activity when you're trying to stop a wildfire,
Yeah.
and very clear memories of one fire that was roaring down on a small isolated ranch in the Chilcotin country, and there was a stand of timber very close to the house, and we managed to stop the fire just by digging a trench in the ground, which is what you do. In just before it got into that stand of timber, and so that always has stayed in my memory, and really, I think one of the things that firefighting taught me is the need to act quickly, make decisions and act on those decisions. And at that time, we actually saw the success from that action. And then I roll forward to that land use planning phase. And at the end of the land use plan, I had the pleasure to spend one day with the Minister of Forests, David Zernhelt, who he was, lived just east of Williams Lake, touring around the central area, the Caribou area, looking at the areas that had been designated for parks, and just the geography of this province, and the gorgeous pieces of country, flying with the helicopter from one to the other, and then all the land in between that as part of the balance, because that's so important in this province, was designated as a working forest, and,
Right.
and designated to still supporting the forest industry. I fast forward a bit from there, John, and I have memories of being in the back rooms of Washington, D.C. This was when I was with Lignum, supporting the negotiation that was going on at the time for the softwood lumber, and the softwood lumber dispute with between Canada and the U.S., and the just the feeling of incredible global power that permeates from the community of Washington, D.C., and the struggle that the industry had from this province, let alone from the country, to try to defend their interests and come to some kind of a working agreement in the face of almost insurmountable power that resides in the legislation in the U.S.
Yeah, I remember that well as well. Is that I at the time was the founding chair of the BC Council Value Added Wood Processors, and and represented the value added sector not only in the province of British Columbia but in Western Canada, Alberta, and BC. And Jay Kerr, your the CEO of Lignum, was very prominent in that group as well. So we negotiated the Canadian position in Ottawa, and then in some occasions we were present in negotiations in Washington as well, and that then was already a problem, the duties, and basically what it was, the allegation that timber access is being subsidized here, so therefore it is damaging the industry and the U.S., and penalties should be paid or should be restricted by quota availability to that market. And the battle, for all intents and purposes, has gone on for 100 years, but in particular, since what they called Lumber One in the early 80s, we started, and I was right involved in Lumber 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I agree with you 100%. The negotiations were always difficult, and obviously, as an industry, we would have paid millions and millions of dollars in duties, and still, it's a major problem today. So yeah, for sure.
And John, you talked about, and I know you're focused on an industry in transition, and things like the Lumber 5, the Softwood Lumber Agreement, have ended up having a huge impact to the ability of this industry to actually change and transform.
No,
And
no question
that
about
was
that.
one of I think, the biggest frustrations, aside from actually having a duty imposed. But the fact that this was another nation's actual commerce department that ended up setting the rules that then very much affected and
And, and,
still affect our
and,
ability to change.
and all driven by some of the politicians in the Senate or in Congress, pushing the political process. Very frustrating. But just to come back to the other thing that I've always believed in, obviously the industry has been in transition. We have going through a period right now of where, because of the reduction of the annual allowable cut, a lot of mills have shut down, about 40 sawmills in the province, including pulp mills, probably 6 or 7. Every 4 or 5 sawmills shuts down a pulp mill, as well as pellet plants, as well as value-added manufacturers. Now, for the benefit and we'll talk about it a little more, but for the benefit of our guests listening to us from around the world, we have this huge forest in British Columbia. How many hectares would it be of our land-based forest approximately?
Well, the land base itself is about 100 million hectares. The forest is about half of that.
Yeah,
So
about.
about 50 million hectares. Yeah.
So what happened then? What made the major changes? And if I look back to the early 80s, we had then, other than occurring fires that would affect the annual allowable cut, but never all that much. It was all calculated in. But then something happened in the Bowron region east of Prince George, where all of a sudden there was a spruce beetle attack, and the people used to say that you could see it from the satellites in the sky, the size of clear cut that was created. I had a little sawmill sitting in that region, just picking up timber that somebody else didn't want and operated. But then something else happened. That was in the early 80s. And then in early 2000, another issue happened, and that happened west of Prince George in the Burns Lake region. And in the park system, Tweedsmuir Park, where the pine beetle pandemic started, that dwarfed what had happened in the Bowron region. It wiped out virtually all, probably 70-80%, probably got better numbers than I have, of the pine in the interior of the province of British Columbia.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, John, because that was part of my role. At the same time that spruce beetle infestation happened in the Bowron you were talking about, there was an earlier pine beetle infestation south of Tweedsmuir Park in the Chilcotin area, and that was my role, was trying to stay on top of that infestation and trying to do something about it. And I can distinctly remember being out in the forest by myself. That was my job at the time, was ribboning out areas in, and middle of July, a hot day in July, and stopping, and you could literally hear the millions of beetles running around under the bark of the tree. There was so many of them, and
And
they
they
were so
were
loud.
about the size of
A grain of rice, they would
a
say. Yeah,
grain of rice, yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
And so that particular infestation, one the beetles, and fascinating, and it's one of the reasons there is a transition in the industry. Is there's actually transition going on in the resource itself, in the timber, and it's very complex, the whole interrelationship. But those beetles develop a natural antifreeze, which is how they survive
Yeah.
the winter.
Yeah.
And there was a winter in the early 80s that it hit minus 30 on Halloween night in the Chilcotin, and they hadn't developed their antifreeze yet,
Yeah.
and they died off. And then the next year also had a very extreme early winter cold event, and that particular pine beetle infestation collapsed. And so then it was, 10 years later, 15 years later, it came back in Tweedsmuir Park, and then has, probably now, taken something like 80% of the mature lodgepole pine that we're growing, and lodgepole pine, a very, very common tree species in the central part of BC.
Yeah. Now, it happened in Tweedsmuir Park. How big is the park approximately? Would you
I think
say?
it's about 2 million hectares. It's a very big park. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what caused it to become that Beetle? Was it because of the abundance of old pine that was down and on the ground? What were
Yeah.
those the
And
reasons for it?
the, like so many things in the field of forestry, there's a suite of facts, and then there's a suite of opinions.
Right.
And the suite of facts, yes, there. Most of the pine was old, over mature is the terminology we use. Pine is compared to other tree species, pine is a short-lived species. Its natural life cycle, after it's about 150 years old, it becomes very susceptible to diseases, and it's not a long lasting. So the park was a prime candidate for an infestation of beetle. Absolutely. One of the techniques that's most successful if you've got a small amount of beetle is go in and log and actually take the food away with the beetles, take the trees out, and try to do some control that way. None of that happened within a park. So there certainly are a lot of opinions that say if there had been more active management of that early infestation that started in the park, because that's where a lot of the old timber was, that the population could have been stopped. But not the opinion I hold, but I know that it definitely started in the park. Sorry, John, started in a preponderance of old trees that were very susceptible.
So that then being said, David, the if you have a park, there are restrictions as to what we can, by law, do inside of those park. And I believe that is that provincial or federal or a combination of all the above, for one.
That was provincial in that case. Yeah.
Right. So would there be merits to making sure that as we also are now replanting the same species, that would be as a combination of the replanting that we are doing today, that we would not want to make sure that in the future, we can be more proactive in trying to prevent that, at least
So
to a certain extent, in the parks.
more proactive at trying to prevent it. But, John, I believe just as importantly, or even more importantly, more proactively managing the forests outside of the park.
Okay.
Yes, the beetles started there, but the beetles then also went into a lot of forests outside of the park that, again, the best tool we have is to replace these older forests, because they were older forests outside of the park, make sustainable wood products from them, log them, make products from them, create employment, create value out of them, and then have thriving younger forests growing instead. And that in the long run, I think, is the much more important tool to make sure that we are very actively managing the forest we have. And just one quick piece, that's one of my reasons why I am still involved with the Forest Enhancement Society. and putting my time in chair of the Forest Enhancement Society, is that's their role, is helping that management and investing back into the forest, and investing that management of the forest.
See, one of the questions that I get asked a lot of times, and obviously that has been, has created a lot of damage in terms of, to the annual allowable cut and other things. But how come that it appears, or it is, that Alberta did typical similar species, similar areas, did so much better in terms of managing the mountain pine beetle epidemic better than we did, or it didn't create as much damage?
So,
Why?
so for one thing, Alberta had nature working for them. They do have regularly those early winter cold snaps. And so there's an element there that controls the beetle. They also did not have as big contiguous areas of over mature pine as there is in the central part of BC. So part of it is the natural factor.
Right.
And then Alberta was much more aggressive in the use of their logging to try to control the beetle.
Yeah, and just like you said, that what we knew about the beetle is that what would stop it if we needed 2 or 3 weeks of 30 below in the early part of the winter, that because the beetles would go to the bottom of the tree and it would then wipe them out as they did at that other location at one point. So so then looking at the industry, what happened really between fires that fairly extensive 2017, 18, and others in combination with the mountain pine beetle started to reduce the annual allowable cut, because what government had to do is to uplift the annual allowable cut, which normally runs approximately around 60 million cubic meters annually. And for our benefit of the people that are watching, the annual allowable cut is carefully calculated as to how much of fiber we will allow to be taken for manufacturing, but still maintain the same volume in the medium to long term. Obviously, pine beetle put us into a position where very quickly they had to deal with the issue of the viability, economic viability of the fiber, and there was an uplift of the annual allowable cut from 60 to about 80 million cubic meters for a period of time that then must result at some point to go back to the normal 60 million feet and then be adjusted downward from there to the more sustainable volume, which is now close to 40 million cubic meters in the what they call the midterm, until the other volumes come back on that have been replanted. Would that kind of
Yes.
describe it?
The good, great description of it. And again, as you mentioned, my role at one time was the chief forester for the province of BC. That's the specific task that the chief forester has, which is determining those allowable annual cuts. And so they're not for the province as a whole, as the numbers you have. That was the adding up
Correct.
of individual areas, individual timber supply areas across the province.
They call them TSAs, timber supply
Yes.
areas. There are numerous of them through the province. Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's what we faced. And you're absolutely right. And Prince George really was the epicenter of dealing with this midterm timber supply issue, where, the sustainable supply in the long run, once the younger forests come back, is actually going to be higher than the current level of cut. But the in the interest of getting ahead of the beetles and primarily of generating some value from all the timber that had been killed by the beetles, the annual allowable cut was raised, and now that's part of the transition, as you say,
Yeah.
is the fact that the industry now, so the overall supply of timber available to the industry has dropped quite considerably.
Right, and that then resulted in mills, sawmills closing, about 40 of them in that area, maybe a few more to come. A number of pulp mills in this region, but throughout the province, 7 or 8 or so. I usually say every 4 or 5 average-sized sawmills represents a pulp mill. Some of the pellet plants have shut down, and then secondary manufacturers, value-added manufacturers, have shut down as well alongside of them because they're all attached to the same forest base. So that then being said, the a lot of time when I talk to young people in particular, and in a general sense on my programs, that I believe that although things are a challenge right now and we're losing operations and many, many jobs because of it, but still the medium to long term is still very, very good because I believe what will happen is that if we do our job well, and you know what that means, then not only can we bring back and are replanting now the forest that we have lost, and for every tree that we knock down, we replant at least 3 or 4 of better quality trees really than we had before, and that that will grow likely faster and quicker. And if we add to that intensive forestry, like it is being done in other areas like Sweden, intensive forestry, then we may well see our forests go back to not only to, it will be a gradual, but the next 40 to 50 years, we'll be back to the 40, 50, 60, 70, and beyond, I believe, to the 90 million cubic meters annually. An example of that, I believe, is Sweden, where they went through the same as we did in some different forms, but about 30, 40 years ago. They started, and the makeup is somewhat different, we all know that, but they started a more intensive forestry. Where they are now, they have too much fiber, not enough manufacturing capacity. That's what I believe we will go. And then at the same time, what I say is that for the young people watching us as an industry, and from experience that you have, I have, and others have, that's saying in the short term, yes, there are challenges. In the long terms, there are opportunities, and the industry will again be a very, very healthy industry. And the example that I usually use, David, is that if I go back to the Bowen physically, where in 2083 I had this little sawmill sitting in the middle of the Bowen, and all around me I looked and there was no timber. If you go there today, and you meaning in a general sense, you will not recognize it. And that's
Yeah.
what happens in this province because we have this, even with the global warming and all the other things that happen, still an amazing province where we can grow the best fiber in the world for manufacturing products of all different sort and descriptions.
So I completely agree with that message, John. Absolutely. There's a huge and very healthy future for the forests in BC and for the industry. There also is, I am convinced, a very healthy future demand for the products we can make as well. And we're starting to see more and more across the world that much more of a recognition of the beauty of wood, the value of wood, the contribution towards climate change and everything else of well managed forests. And so um, huge opportunity for all of us, huge opportunity not just for young people for careers, but for this province. Absolutely, it is, and I think, and I know, John, you've been in the forefront of this for many years. Also, an opportunity for us to try to get as much value as we can out of the products that we produce and out of the forest that we grow. And I would say that that's also part of our challenge. And that's
Y-
part of this transformation that needs to continue within the industry.
Yeah, and then that again, and I agree with you 100%, is that for the communities, and especially right now, with the changes that have taken place, not only because of the less of the timber is available for the AAC being around 40 million cubic meters annually, but then other values of the timber have been set aside, may it be for caribou, may it be for other parts that are taking part in the forest. First Nations will likely get 20% of the AAC and share in the revenue of that timber. And I think that's the right thing, and it's a good thing. And then, the other part I've been quite involved and been quite vocal about is that I think we should stimulate and attract investment in value-added manufacturing. But in order to do that, we have to have reasonable expectation of access to fiber. I say reasonable expectation of access to fiber. I'm not saying tenure, but that's what I'm saying. And that the facts are that probably 75% of the timber is controlled by half a dozen companies that control 75% of the AEC, and virtually, and I'm not beating up on my peers around the COFI boardroom table because I'm the vice chair of COFI, but every so often I need to say what I believe is the right thing to say, is that, because of the manufacturing of lumber in the province of British Columbia has not been, in the past it used to be globally competitive, it is not now. That's a challenge for all of us, including government, that we have to bring us back to global competitiveness. But in the meantime, the ones that have controlled the fiber have gone to other places like the US Southeast and to Sweden and other places. And that has not been good. But in the meantime, secondary manufacturers has been a problem. At one point, when I talked about that a little bit earlier, when I was the founding president of the BC Council Value Added Wood Processor, we had 8 associations, 800 companies. Now we have less than probably 1/3 of that, if that, and all of them are in jeopardy. Up north here, we used to have 50 value-added manufacturers. We have now 3, of which likely we will lose 2, and maybe at best have only 1 left. What is the low-hanging fruit? And other than the obvious, obviously we see that too much of the products that could be further manufactured here are being sent elsewhere. Not because of price, but simply because of it is easier or some other reasons. The other one that is a bit of a no-brainer, and you were involved in that, and so was I, is with the softwood lumber duty that the Americans said the reason for that is that we are subsidizing timber, but that secondary manufacturers have become casualties or somewhat of in the process of being kind of thrown under the bus. Is that we have no timber in secondary manufacturers and still are paying up to as high not now, but at this moment it's maybe around 10, but up to 20%. At one point, we didn't, and we made the argument successfully that duties should only be paid, if at all, by secondary manufacturers on the input, on first mill. That whole argument was not even raised in Lumber 5. And that, again, became very costly to the secondary manufacturing sector and should be addressed. And obviously, I'm talking to government about that. And the other part that is troubling is that, too much of the fiber that could be further manufactured here is sent elsewhere simply because it's helpful. And then, in early 2000, the small business program that used to be designated to stimulate investment in value-added manufacturing, unfortunately is no longer there. And is obviously somewhat caught up in politics and part of the intentions paper, well meant by government, but unfortunately it is not quite where it should be. But what I see is that, with First Nations involving in having access to timber, I think that's a good thing. In terms of recognizing other values like water, caribou, and all the other things, that is a good thing, but it will create more involvement in where is the timber and where should it be designated to or for what reason. It likely will, in the short term, put additional pressure on the AAC. It likely will push up prices of incremental volumes. And the thing where I'm concerned about those lumber companies that have, where some of the major ones have maybe up to 75% or better of wood under tenure. Some of the ones that have much less than that, 50% or less, will have to pay major premiums on accessing incremental volumes. I believe we still see potentially casualties there. And so what I'm still saying to government is that, and to communities, that become more involved, become more vocal about it in terms of you want access to your fiber, a kind of a form of appurtenancy, which meant at one point that lumber should be manufactured in the region where it is harvested, or what we call the social contract, is that access to fiber is a privilege. For those that are getting the fiber, there is an obligation involved in the social contract and trying to add as much social and economic value as possible in the region. But with all of that, things will be sorted out at some point.
Yeah. So I agree with you. It will be sorted out. John, what you're really exemplifying is the challenge that we have in BC when the ownership of the resource is you and I, is the public, but it is private companies that actually turn that resource into an economic value, into jobs, into products. And they talk about public-private partnerships, and I think the forests of BC are a classic example of that. But there also are challenges to partnerships, and there are challenges to that public-private. And we've had a history in BC of government trying to intervene in that relationship to try to create the transition that's needed. And some of that has been very successful, and lots of it hasn't. And that's, you're an entrepreneur at heart. That's what you are. And yet you see that there is a government intervention that's needed to try to get the conditions to where we need to be in BC, and that's our challenge.
Yeah, what I see, David, is limited involvement where government cannot create those incentives. But I say to my peers around the boardroom table of COFI, and I'm their vice chair, amazingly, the only one is not tenured, is that it is in your benefit, fellow board members, to recognize that if there is no economic benefit to go and sell your wood elsewhere if it can be further manufactured here. That's good for you in the long term, and it deals with the issues around the concept of the social contract that is uniquely different here from where it is elsewhere. And I believe that's where the future is. Like for our company, normally when all things are normal, we employ 400 people. I've never had a nickel from government handouts or subsidies, and I don't want them. So I do not like the idea. I believe it is wrong that government and that industry did not defend the secondary manufacturing from being protected from paying duties if they have no timber. And it was simply, we put it in place, but we were not part of it the last go around, simply because they didn't think it would be in their benefit, unfortunately. That should never happen. And then, some of the other things, then that I sometimes question, and I kind of say this in a constructive way, is that if we go all over the world, paid for by government, looking for markets for our products, what do we want to sell them? What dimension lumber?
Yeah.
For what they don't buy dimension lumber. So they either buy the extreme high grades or the low grades. Like China, we were all excited about it, that they're buying so much of our lumber, but they're buying all the low grades. And, they are bottom feeders and they're paying less for it than secondary manufacturers would. Those kind of, and I don't want to over-belabor that in our conversation, but simply there are what I call low-hanging fruit that would help the industry as a whole of recognizing that. Unfortunately, where we are now, there are not many secondary manufacturers left in the province, and that's very unfortunate. And at some point, hopefully that will start coming back. Yeah.
So when you come back to that story that you have for young people, not only is there a huge opportunity just in the resource itself, and not only is there a huge opportunity in the kind of products that we can make, but there's such a huge opportunity in us really making this public-private partnership work and really getting the value out of our forests that we can. And so all of those things are so exciting.
Yeah, and I believe
all
that.
of those things. Yeah.
I believe that too, David, and it's exciting to get First Nations more involved. I did a keynote address in Telkwa last Monday, actually, for a group of people, and it was just amazing to be there and to kind of feel it's a challenge there on the west side as well in terms of balancing fiber to capacity to manufacturing. Unfortunately, Canfor just announced today officially they're shutting down the Houston sawmill, which will affect some of the other plants around it as well, including potentially pellets and other things. But still, even with all of that, I still believe that there is huge potential, in looking forward for opportunities for jobs. The industry, what I say is this, David, that I believe that there is a huge future for the industry, that once investors again will invest in BC and we will be competitive, the mills will be smaller, they will cut smaller logs, they will have more technology, they will employ less people in the mill, but it will be in combination with what I call innovative primary, in combination with intensive secondary, where we will take the top 25% of this amazing fiber we grow here and 25% of the lower grades and drive it up the value chain. That's in combination with pellets and in combination with pulp, paper, and other products around, bioenergy, and all of those things together. That's where the industry will be, and that's where we have to train people for those kind of jobs that 40 years down the road is long for you and me, but it isn't if I look back at the Barren. That to me only feels like it was yesterday. And so we have to invest in creating, schools like we have here, the College of New Caledonia, invest in those schools to teach the people of the future those new technology jobs, so that we can not only have the fiber, we have the location, we have the transportation infrastructure. Do we have the people and the skill sets that we need to support those investments to make us the best in the world? And we can, you know. And but it takes First Nations, it takes communities have to become more active and stand up and saying, we want that industry, we want it in our regions. Not to beat up on the ones, but simply saying, we want to be part of saying, what will it look like as we go forward?
So John, I have to think of your podcast itself and the title, and on the brink is often interpreted as on the brink of a collapse. But really what you're painting, which I believe, is we're on the brink of an opportunity. And it's
Absolutely.
just up to us and it's up to the communities to
Absolutely.
grasp that opportunity. Absolutely.
There is no better place in the world than Canada. There is no better place in Canada than BC. And with the opportunities that we have in BC, because of location, the natural resources that we have here, is that there is no place that is better located in terms of proximity to future market. The opportunities are here, and they will be here going forward. And for us, it then becomes a question of what does it look like and what part do we want to play in it? It's a land of opportunity.
Well put.
David, thank you for being part of my podcast, and thank you for all your thoughts and your sharing with us your views and your history, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John, for the invitation, and thank you for the podcast itself and carrying on the dialogue.